Hey everyone, Swiggles1987 here, and today I will be creating my first tutorial, and this will be a guide on how to program MIDI drums using, Easy Drummer or Superior Drummer for your music, specifically rock and metal-oriented music, and even more specifically, I want to make this video to help out people in the, game and music covering sort of community. I've seen a lot of people struggle with creating drums, or realistic drums for that matter, and I've spent a year and a half, maybe more, learning and slowly understanding it. So I want to pass on my non-drummer understanding of how to program drums as best as I can, and I can't stress enough how little actual drums I can play, but through a lot of help from drummer friends, I think I've gotten the experience. So let's just dive in, and hopefully I will help you guys out. So let's just hop on to it. I'm using Mixcraft 6.1, build 204, and I will be using Superior Drummer just because the samples in it are so good, but I guarantee any drum kit, MIDI drum kit, or sample library should do the trick, and the principles will be the same because the instrument's the same. So first thing, I'm going to get rid of everything here except I'm going to create a virtual instrument track, or a MIDI track, and we're going to go open up which instrument we want to use, and we're going to click on VST, and we're going to scroll down to your drum program. That might be Superior, Easy Drummer, Steven Slate. Now, first things first, you're going to want to click whatever button opens you up to edit your actual VST, and this is going to take you to the awesome screen known as your construct your drum kit. It gives you a picture, tells you what your kit literally is. Now, a drum kit is comprised of different parts, and just like how your pickups work or how your strings work, a drummer or a programmer of drums must know how his drum kit works. We're going to start with the kick drum, and first off, just shut everything off and then listen to how one sounds. Now that's just me clicking around, but if you have recognized that sound, then you're already one step ahead. If not, or if you don't know where this kick drum comes into play when you hear music, listen to your favorite song right now. Just pause the video and try to listen in. See where that kick is coming from, the big thump that comes in and out of play. And you want to really get a good understanding of where it comes into play and where it doesn't, more importantly. A good technique in music that I've come to see and hopefully one day implement is less is more a lot of the time. And the kick drum is used, but a lot of music, including metal music, sometimes abuses it, or it won't let up, and you don't breathe in without breathing out. You don't have a rise without a fall. So you want to understand how to use it. Now, in a song, sometimes you'll hear it the first beat of a measure. Now, I'm going to assume that watching this video, you understand some of these music theory terms. They're very elementary, and I'm sure you could Google some basics on rhythm, because that's what we're playing with here. We could imagine, 1, 2, 3, E4, but is that really the rhythm, the groove, the texture that you want to create out of your song? These are the questions to ask yourself constantly. Now, the snare sounds like that, and we're going to use it a lot on the second and fourth beat of 4/4 time songs. And the snare really has a lot of, it can accent certain parts of each measure, and it can, it's snappy and it has the power to command attention. So when you're striking it, and if you look at a real snare, like let's just take a look at this, it's head being tied down here, so it can sound very tight and snappy like this one. But you can hear a bit of resonance and that bounciness. If you listen to a marching band play, those snare drums that they're playing, they have a lot of different sounds to them based on where you hit it, such as playing a side stick, which I don't think I can demonstrate in this. But the main thing I want you to take away from snares is that, and with maybe every instrument on this kit, is that you can adjust the velocity and you can change the way it sounds completely. Now, velocity is how hard you strike an instrument. on a piano, if you play, say, a C note and you go bum, maybe you press it lightly, but if you really strike it down, it'll have a different texture to it. It'll be harsher, it'll be, thicker, and if you press it soft, it'll have a gentleness about it. So keep that in mind also when playing or programming drums. Now let's go to the hi-hat, which is the first cymbal kind of based instrument. Now the hi-hat is actually two cymbals. If you imagine almost like plates made of brass, and they're touching each other when they're held down, but there's a pedal at the bottom that actually controls whether they touch or not. And when you have closed hi-hats, you get a sound like that. And I'll show you later that when you open them, you're going to have this wider kind of sound. It may be a little more abrasive, but it gives you a nice flavor to have that going on. Now, all of these crazy guys up here, those are cymbals, and specifically they're either crash or the smaller ones. The smaller ones are generally called splash, and the effect these have is, they heighten and excite and accent the ends of different phrases. So just as an example, and I don't want you to get hung up on, what I'm programming. What I basically did is added a crash to the beginning of the next phrase, and I'm just going to make a marker next phrase. So if we hear it all together, there's a steady groove going on, and then 1, 2, 3, 4. And what I just did as far as macros is I copied the very first loop that's one measure long, and I placed it at the second to last, so I could modify it enough to to segue into the next portion. And I clicked on the crash symbol, which is aligned with this note on our MIDI keyboard, and I just clicked it, at this 2, which represents that 5 actually. It's the beginning of a new phrase, so that way I can, I can copy and paste a lot of the repeating segments, and I can still put an additional portion, and then I can drag my loop back and say I could do it the whole thing. Dynamic songs have, exciting raised notes sometimes, and these hits really help. You get, your ears literally will be filled with like this excitement for a second. So what are these guys? These are toms, and these are rack toms. They're placed on top of the kick, and they have a higher, a higher frequency. If you look at them literally, the smaller a drum is, the higher pitch it is, and there's some physics behind it that I don't think we all need to really understand. They almost sound, like African percussion, perhaps, or Latina percussion, Latin percussion, and we can use them for that function, as well as, if you see what I did here to transition. And we're just going to call this a fill, actually. So fills can last, 4 beats in one measure like that. We can make the whole thing something. And all a fill really is, by definition, or by my definition, is some piece that transitions into the next portion of a song. And it usually can be a little bit of like a trick or something advanced, a little show-off. You're performing live, a lot of these are improvised anyway. And it just serves to transition. That's all we want to do. And if we didn't, then it would sound kind of boring. See, there's no real way to feel like you changed anything in the song. So why don't we try playing around, and I'm just going to go ahead and say that a lot of what I'm doing is based on experience and listening. So if you listen to drums, watch, drum playthroughs on YouTube, I'm going to assume that a lot of you aren't drummers. So you can see here, this is aligned with snare right, and I'm just going to go ahead and try to increase the size so you can read this. Hopefully I can add some text annotations too, but this says rack T3 head. So that means that we're hitting the rack of tom number 3, and Mr. Tom are these, and you can see like the that's the same sound we're playing. Now these are floor toms, so why don't we take out this whole thing, Mr. Phil, and we create a new one just using our floor toms. So you know, this isn't about really making an idea that'll work. Sometimes you can just use one of the heads like that, one of the floor toms, as part of the other kind of fill we made where we were playing with the rack toms. Sometimes you'll hear something crazy like that's just a good example of how drums were programmed in the 80s, back when, you know, it was still a new concept. So, you know, you'd have ludicrous, crazy kind of drums. So now that we've understood essentially every part, we just have one more called the ride, and this is a larger kind of cymbal with a beautiful way of use. There's different kinds of grooves you can create out of the ride. Essentially, it's got a gentler kind of sound, though it kind of feels wider. The ride is basically serving a function to similar to the hi-hat. In one sense of the meaning, you can actually use it almost in the same rhythm, but it does have a different texture and it carries a different sound about it, so you want to be careful. Now, what we can do is, I can show you also how the ride cymbal can also be used in a different context. Now, even though I was hitting it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 in eighths, you couldn't hear it every single 8 times because the kind of rhythmic pattern that we were creating kind of overpowered it. And that's where you also want to keep a balance, because if you have all the sound going on in the drummer, mixing drum parts is, you know, no different than mixing instrument parts, in that if you don't give each one enough balance with the others, you're not going to be able to hear everything clearly. Now that we understand everything about the kit, how do we go about programming drums? To understand this, I'll preface it with the fact that you absolutely have to listen to music, and you have to listen to it differently each time. Now, when listening to music, you want to try to focus in on the drums if you don't have a good grip on drums, as well as whatever you can get out of this guide. And as you listen to the instrument played more, you're going to get a good sense of what sounds good and what doesn't. And that's the ultimate question I seem to see. And ultimately, it does come down to what you enjoy. But sometimes it's hard to figure out what you enjoy if you don't know it just quite yet. So let's go ahead, and now that we have everything here, let's try and build what we're going to call a drum groove. What I did there is I just clicked twice and I got a little measure's worth of MIDI track. This is a piano roll MIDI editor. You will get this with Reverb, Mixcraft, possibly every digital audio workstation. You're going to have a lot of stuff on the side if you're using Mixcraft, and the most important thing, if you have the option, is find a map, a piano map, MIDI map, and try to set it to the same one you have. You're going to have a list, and it's going to include all of your MIDI products, especially the ones that, you know, you can't just hit a random button and know it. And this is a tip that I don't think a lot of people know. Now, each one of these is a beat. Now, the way you can tell that is because there's a huge line dividing it. We're in 4/4 time according to our digital audio workstation. So we should have a good idea that 4/4 time, you know, there's going to be 4 beats. We're in a tempo of 120 BPM. You can change this by clicking it, make it 5 million if you want. And what you want to do here is observe what you're programming. Now your snap. This is the most important thing in the everything, MIDI programming, because this determines whether your drums are going to be off or whether you, you know, can program well. If you have never done a cover or created a song before, you do not know your instrument too well, and but you want to record, and you want to record something easy, do not snap above 1/8, please, because this is basically what's keeping you from playing on and off time. Now what this does is, if we divide this into 4 parts like it is right now, you can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 partitions. That's 1/8 notes. I personally never go above 1/32. If you're going here, you're doing something extremely careful, or you're probably going to mess up unless you really know what you're doing. Just as a sign, if you're watching a guide on how to program drums. Now snapping is going to drag it into a designated place. Now the word for this is also known as quantization, which is a crazy word that literally just means that we're sticking to specific understandable integer. Say you just watched your favorite drummer's video on YouTube, and now you want to recreate what Mr. Maximum Hamburgers did. Let's try starting with a kick and a snare, and a kick, kick, snare. And a lot of stuff you can do is just from listening and saying, oh, he went like boom, chuck, boom, boom, chuck. Wait, that's just... this is the velocity, and as I mentioned, this is how hard you strike your instrument. So I keep mine at 100, and then I lower it and raise it depending on the context. Now if I scroll up, we've got closed edge hi-hats. They're all different sounds, and you're getting a more realistic sound, but, you know, that was something I shouldn't have done maybe for the sake of tutorial. So let's try this. But we can always mix it up now that we've created something. What if we made it a little funkier? So some things are clashing, and this is an important skill in everything. If you hear something off, try to be able to determine why it is. So if we isolate what it is, the snare and the hi-hat are opening, which is what this guy is, at the same time. Imagine how your guitar sounds to fit with the drums. You're not playing separate things after all. You're playing multiple instruments to play the same song. You could try imagining a spike up of notes or something accented powerfully during that one part. So you can already imagine maybe like the Thomas the Tank Engine song, like da 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 da, something like that. Now one thing we can do, of course, is this is the velocity, and no human hits a drum kit the same level, so we can kind of mess around with it, and depending on your digital audio workstation, you can do that easier and better. So it already sounds a little bit better, but this is just an example. But now I want to go into which is how to create different appropriate grooves. Here's a traditional one. So here's one that you might have heard in like some sort of funk or maybe even hip-hop fashion. Now, one thing I'm doing is I'm not putting the kick drum in every single spot. That's just going to waste a lot of air. Now, one key thing that we can do to also spruce this up is we can play with that pedal that controls a hi-hat. And it's just getting more and more realistic. Ideally, that's going to be the difference between your song or cover and someone else's. Now, what I did here is, this is going to be a metal example. What this really demonstrated was a good use of the kick drum, where you get to make it, you know, do some cool stuff, but you're not abusing it again, which I personally think is the biggest, the weirdest thing to see in beginner drum or beginner covers with drums. That's good lemonade. What I like here is a lot of people forget to change which crash cymbal you're kind of riding on. So remember to switch it up when you can, but also don't do it too much, or else it's just this chaotic, look how many cymbals I have because, I got Easy Drummer and stuff. Also, visualize your drummer. Visualize him, because if someone can't play that, then in general, in contemporary music, No one's played that way. So a lot of metal music, it depends on you using the crashes the same way we use our hi-hat. And that's one thing to take away. And I'm using a China cymbal here, which has this interesting higher frequency kind of so that's commonly used in a lot of genres that way. So just there, da-da-da, snare kick, and then we wait. We wait because we want to create anticipation, and we're giving air. We're giving air to what just happened. Okay, mixing your individual drum kit. Now, a lot of people are just going to be content with what you have in Easy Drummer, but as I've learned a lot, I will attribute a lot of it also to a good friend, Jay Parecki95. We're going to have a lot of things we don't like about our drum kit default, and we're going to have a lot of stuff we want to emphasize. Somewhat scratch. Now, if you're using Superior Drummer or Easy Drummer, you're going to have a mixer. And if you're using, what we want to do here is kind of just understand what all of it does in a limited fashion for sake of time, and because, you know, a lot of it will probably come slowly with time. So let's just see what we can do with each part. Now this is your kick drum, KD, in, and as we raise it, you kind of get a good sense of what it sounds like. And I'm using decent mixing headphones, so it's important to have good overhead headphones so you can hear the range of it, because it's going to be in the lower frequencies. Now, I personally like boosting it a little. Now, the difference between kick in and out is one is boosting how much you're taking in, and one is boosting how much output after it's been, you know, virtually processed. And I say virtually because that's all this really is. Now, if you listen to just the out, sounds a little higher, so maybe if you don't want that sort of sound, you can reduce it. Now, for a lot of progressive metal and stuff, I noticed that the kick drums sometimes sound a little, these subs, it's the sub frequencies. This is the stuff that you feel. Let's just play back with all three of these S, or soloed. Now, these three are all snare drum, or SD microphones. Now, top, bottom, 1176, the easiest way I can explain that is if you look at the snare. Some people mic it from the top, some people mic it from the bottom. You will get a different sound. I've already got a preset made, my personal favorite volumes of snares. So what you want to do is try seeing how much of the top microphone you want. I personally have no problem muting the bottom mic as if I didn't use it. So a lot of that bottom sound is just not my thing. Now this one's a different kind of microphone, I believe. Hi-hats, you can reduce them if they're too harsh. I didn't use them in this example, so I won't really mess with them. That's why you need a good example that uses all of it. Or if you're working in a song, maybe look for the section that has the hi-hats when you're adjusting the hi-hats. Who would have thought? Now, RT1, 2, 3 are individual for each one of the toms. Now, this is rack tom 1. Now, floor toms I know we use later on, so why don't we listen to those and see what we can do. We could volume it differently, but I like to keep it where it is. Some of these presets are pretty great, so there's no shame really in just trying each one of those out, maybe changing up the volume. Now the overhead mic is what hangs above drum kit, and that's going to pick up your crashes. Now sometimes that might be too loud, so let's see what happens. Now, a lot of this other stuff is extraneous for me, or, you know, I don't know what it is. If I load up my drum kit, now, this one's called Swiggles Kit, and I'm not going to lie, a lot of these were just the default ones, and then taking a little bit of time to change the volume on them so that they would be more suited to the sound I wanted. So let's try that. Now, I like to define my kit as, you know, a little more ballsier. It's got a little more bass to it, a little more depth. My effect channel, and let me just wipe everything. is generally just equalization of the entire thing, and I'm going to use Fab Filters Pro Q for that. You can use any Voxengo equalizer, anything that's a graphic equalizer I think will do you a good job. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to have it set to 12 decibels, and basically what we've got here is equalizer, which shows you the frequency range of your drums. Now I'm going to put in a compressor, and what a compressor does is essentially it maintains a volume level for your instrument, and when the volume exceeds a certain amount, it starts using code in order to reduce the volume, and essentially you're flattening. If you look at the sound waves, so let's first of all, the threshold is how much of a volume in general you're trying to aim for, and like a threshold of many things, how much it can take before you want it to compress. The ratio is essentially, in short, how harsh you want it to be and visualizing it. So say if I make it up here and then I just make the ratio like that, it's not going to apply a lot of compression. It's not really scooching it down. But if I add this, if I make this ratio higher and higher, it's kind of going to like flatline it, and I kind of like this visualization better. I use like 3 to 5 for rhythm guitars, and then of course I put it up here. For drums we can be a little harsher, but I just put the ceiling on that a little higher. And this is a lot of stuff that Maximum Hamburgers, who actually mixes real drums, has kind of taught me, and I go a lot with that ideology now. So the ratio is really sharp, but it's also giving a lot of threshold, so I think that's a good balance. Attack is basically how many seconds before, when it's hit the point that it needs to start compressing, it starts. Or release is, once it's going down, when to stop. So it recovers really quickly. Now that you've gotten all of that basically down, let's hear how it sounds together. Now, one last thing to do is add some reverb. Now, the dry mix is how much it sounds without reverb. Literally, this is... Now, as I increase the wet mix, you're going to hear more of that reverby sound, as if it was coming from, some sort of echoey room. And you can, as you drop the dry mix, it lets more of this come through in a way. The reverberation is how much it's going to be echoing. And the high frequency dampening would be a way to stop it from getting, too much of that weird sound. That, in short, is kind of how I go about making drums, equalizing drums, compressing drums. Hopefully this has been a really good entry point for people who want to start programming drums and don't know how, people who can and aren't really sure where to go or how to create some realistic drum sounds, or even advanced people who want to try to spice up their sound. I, once again, am not a drummer. Feel free to leave a comment or let me know that this guide helped or didn't help. Send me a message on here on facebook.com/wiggles1987. Post a video response or send me a video if you think that if you made a video with my drum guide as a help or basis, and I'd love to check it out, and hopefully you guys will be able to program drums better. If you're an actual drummer and you were offended by this video, I do apologize profusely. Thank you.